So hello, webinar attendees. My name is Marisol Morales, and I serve as the Vice President for Network Leadership with Campus Compact, and we hope that you and your families and communities are staying healthy and taking care of each other during this time. We'll first begin with the land acknowledgement. So as a step towards honoring the truth and achieving healing and reconciliation, Campus Compact seeks to acknowledge the traditional native lands on which we stand. Given that we are gathering for today's webinar from across the country, and some maybe from around the world, we invite you to acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of the Native people where you are joining us from, and you can do that in the chat. I myself am participating from Chicago, which is located on the traditional homelands of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations. Many other tribes, such as the Miami, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Sac, and Fox, called this area home. The region has long been a center for Indigenous people to gather, trade, and maintain kinship ties. Today, one of the largest urban American Indian communities in the United States resides in Chicago. Members of the community continue to contribute to the life of the city and celebrate their heritage, practice traditions, and care for the land and waterways. We also want to recognize and stand in solidarity with those individuals who are continuing to call for racial justice and equitable communities and to affirm that Black Lives Matter. We commit to move beyond words into programs and actions that fully embody a commitment to full participation and equity. So again, welcome to our webinar, our participants and our panelists. So we're really excited to have our webinar today, which is titled The Quest for Authentic Community Engagement, How Market Forces Shape Community Engagement and What to Do About It, with our presenters who we'll be introducing shortly. But I do want to make a couple of announcements about some upcoming programming that Campus Compact is having. First, our Fusion course, Enhancing Online Education Through Community-Based Learning. We're opening up another section of that, and that course will be running March 23rd through April 1st. I will post a link to that in the chat if folks are interested in signing up for that course. The other exciting news I want to announce is that we're opening up our second cohort of our Engaged Scholars Initiative. This is a program focused on early career faculty and community engagement professionals, centering equity and being able to connect folks across the country in this cohort of professional development and leadership. And I will also post that information in the chat if folks are interested. The deadline for that, I believe, is March 25th for applications to be turned in. Let's see, let me go and introduce our panelists. First, I'd like to introduce Gavin Luter, who is the Managing Director of University Alliance, a network of leaders at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, serving as the front door for local governments who want to leverage teaching, research, and service to improve their communities. And as many of you know, Gavin used to work for Campus Compact as our director in Wisconsin. Next, I'd like to introduce Henry Taylor Jr., who's a professor at the University of Buffalo and the director of the Center for Urban Studies. Next, Jamila Dunker, who serves as the director for community engagement in the Office of Community and Governmental Relations at the University of Pittsburgh. Then we have Ken Reardon, who's a professor and director of the Masters in Urban Planning and Community Development at UMass Boston. And finally, Kent Koth, who's the founding director of Seattle University Center for Community Engagement. Welcome to our panelists, and I will turn it over to you now.
Great. Thank you so much, Marisol. It's a pleasure to be back with Campus Compact and really glad we could be doing this. I wish we could be doing it in person at the Campus Compact event, but it's all good. This is second best. So thanks to everybody who's joined in, and thank you so much to our distinguished panelists who are taking their time to do this. I'm just going to offer some framing comments and then moderate some of the questions and answers. But let me just say that this idea was born when Henry Taylor and I were having a conversation about the University of Pennsylvania's model. Everybody knows in higher education, community engagement, probably what UPenn does. And their kind of working hypothesis is if you change the school, you change society, you change the economy, you change how people are thinking and their consciousness. But Henry had a hunch. He said, you know, I actually think the economy and society are shaping the schools. We can't truly understand how to transform society unless we understand the political economic forces that are creating the context in which we educate kids. And that really got me to thinking about, how market forces are really shaping community engagement. So when I was a PhD student at University of Buffalo, I was working on a paper about anchor institutions, and we started to come across this idea of the entrepreneurial university, of public-private partnerships really taking over in higher education and state support of higher ed going down. And of course, these frameworks shape community engagement. How could they not? Yet all of our literature is completely blind to the fact that the economy is shaping higher education. Civic engagement, the movement of civic engagement, was actually originally designed to be a Band-Aid movement. It was called, in Salt Marsh's publication, a community service movement, never actually designed to get at the structural reasons that we have inequities in communities across the United States and across the world. So we all want our community engagement stuff to have an impact. But if we really care about our work making an impact, we will never be able to do this if our eyes are not fully wide open and ignorant of the larger economic forces that corrupt, frankly, the very heart of what we do. We need to understand what constrains us if we are able to actually do meaningful work. And so that's what we are here to talk about today. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Henry Taylor to offer some larger framing comments, and then we'll go to our panelists. Just got to take yourself off mute, Henry.
Thank you very much, Gavin. And it's a pleasure to be here with you today. The coronavirus pandemic and the brutal murder of George Floyd exposed the fault lines of American racism and revealed how little progress the civic engagement movement had made over the last 35 years. What went wrong? In 1990s, the University of Pennsylvania Netta Center advanced the neighborly community paradigm to guide the transformation of Black and Brown communities into great places to live, work, play, and raise a family. The Netta Center model featured the university-assisted community school as a strategic subsystem with the potential to transform neighborhoods with arrested development into progressive, well-developed places to live. For the past 3 decades, university faculty, staff, and students have used service learning and varied education, housing, health, employment training, and other social and community development projects to build the neighborly community. These efforts fell short. Marginalized Black and Brown places were not turned into neighborly community, and gentrification and cultural displacement became the dominant storyline in American cities. The civic engagement movement failed to meet expectations because it did not understand the role of market forces in arresting the development of Black and Brown communities. For the most part, in their service learning and community development activities, the movement ignored the havoc created by the destructive forces, market forces, and the predatory activities of property owners. In urban communities, land is a commodity which people buy and sell for profit. Within this context, the racist American land valuation system is a destabilizing and disruptive force that arrests development in Black and Brown communities. In 1932, Frederick Babcock based his land value system of neighborhood on the neighborhood life cycle theory, which argued that the Black presence in a community signaled the onset of residential decline. Babcock forged his theory on the idea that as the percent white and social class exclusivity increases in a community, measured in terms of median household income and the percent of people with a college degree, so does its housing value and wealth producing capacity. On the flip side, as the percent Black and social class inclusivity increases, the housing value and wealth producing capacity of those communities decrease. This paradigm theorizes that the devaluation of houses in Black neighborhood triggers increases in the housing value of white communities. Land value, then, is the engine that drives the residential segregation process. Residential segregation not only traps Black and brown people in residential space, but it enables predatory property owners to exploit the captured population by charging them high rents for poor quality housing units. This exploitation is made possible because Black and brown residents do not own the land where they build their communities. Thus, ineffective housing laws and weak housing and building code enforcement systems allow predatory landlords and malevolent governments to engage in activities that arrest development and create unhealthy living conditions. This analysis problematizes civic engagement activities that do not account for the action of market forces, especially those activities taking place in the university shadows. Universities, medical schools, hospitals, and innovation districts prioritize commodity value and land above all else. Land developers want to maximize profits, and universities and cities wish to flip land from low to high value uses. Eds and meds in their new role as drivers of the knowledge economy will automatically embrace gentrification, as well as disguise their the predatory nature of their activities. In the end, the land value principle will always triumph. As the percent of white and social class inclusivity increases, values go up and wealth producing capacity increases. When this principle is invoked, neighborhood and cultural displacement always occur. On the removal issue, it doesn't matter if the displacement is caused by the construction of a new science building or an apartment complex, or simply because the rent was raised. It does not matter. Displacement is displacement, and the gentrification process includes all activities that allow property owners to flip land from low to high value uses. The civic engagement movement must confront these market forces and predatory activities head on. The abundant neighborhood effect literature demonstrates that Black and brown people will never get free if they live in stigmatized and marginalized neighborhoods where the actions of market forces, predatory landlords, and malevolent government officials arrest development. The Black community is now the epicenter of systemic structural racism and the site of contestation spawned by the maturing knowledge economy. Across the nation, in city after city, we see high-valued land uses pushing against low-value uses. In essence, much of urban America is now dominated by what I call gentrification pressure zones, which refer to areas of the city that have not been gentrified, but that are in danger of being gentrified. For these reasons, the next rendering of the civic engagement movement, which I call Civic Engagement 3.0, must pursue an alternative approach to university-led community revitalization, which centers on neighborhood stabilization. The goal is to build a stable, rebel neighborhood. In building the rebel neighborhood, the aim is to give residents collective ownership and control over the land where they build their community. For example, if school-age students are displaced from a community, it will not matter what happens in the university-assisted school because they won't be there. Likewise, any healthcare program will be limited if it cannot reduce the social determinants of undesirable health outcomes clustered in those underdeveloped neighborhoods. Simply put, The community engagement movement must prioritize the decommodification and removal of neighborhood land and housing from the speculative land and housing market before education, health, housing, employment, and other social reforms will work. Neighborhood stabilization, therefore, must be centered in the activities of universities rather than placed on the fringe. The intentional goal must be to build the rebel neighborhood. The secret to gaining control over land and housing and development arrested communities is to pursue a strategy based on participatory democracy, communal ownership, shared equity, and a culture that supports and reinforces a collective way of life. The community land trust is the most vital tool in this quest for communal ownership, and it must be pursued with other forms of collective ownership, including cooperatives, limited cooperatives, deed-restricted housing, and condominiums. The approach must also be pursued with an aggressive economic development strategy that aims to build community wealth by developing worker-owned shops and stores, cooperatives, and a range of social capitalist ventures. The regeneration activities has to also include strategies for remaking the institutions and programs that service the communities, including healthcare institutions, schools, and the police. Lastly, the rebel neighborhood paradigm also includes a radical residential mobility scheme to enable those Blacks desirous of leaving the community to move to other parts of the metropolis. This strategy is not about race mingling, but it is about transforming these white-dominated neighborhoods so that they can accommodate the cultural, economic, and social needs of the Black and brown newcomers. In closing, Civic Engagement 3.0 must center neighborhood in equity and the struggle to build just cities, which is based on racial and social class inclusion and socioeconomic justice. The goal is to build the rebel neighborhood. Thank you.
Thanks, Henry. I appreciate it. Just about right at 10 minutes as well. A lot to unpack there. So at that, I'm going to turn it over to Jamie, as I know her, to start her presentation. And I hope everybody can see my slides and it all looks good. All right, Jamie.
Thanks, Gavin. I have to say, I was so enthralled by Henry here. I am a little bit nervous to shift gears a little bit, but I do want to share a little bit of information about how the University of Pittsburgh is pushing back against market pressures in a number of ways, including, first, making intentional investments in critical practice and practitioners, in helping to fully develop a team that is more broadly addressing an anchor strategy that can encourage economic opportunity and inclusion, and by also decentering the university in unique and innovative ways so that we're able to put community voice first and shift away from university prescribing solutions for community. And we can go on to the next slide. So I'll share a little bit about my role as Director of Community Engagement, because that means different things in different institutions. I have both an internal facing and an external facing role. What you see here on this slide are some of the internal ways in which our team supports community engagement capacity broadly and also critical practice broadly, as we've been able to start to assemble practitioners and like-minded units in order to shift the culture on our campus. I co-chair an outreach and engagement community of practice for our staff. Those folks are self-identified community engagement practitioners that are interested in learning the ways in which the university is engaging with our neighborhoods, sharing best practices, and also shifting our practices through the power of numbers so that we're able to bring grass tops pressure to our institution in order to really kind of shift the way that we're talking and the way that we're practicing our engaged work. We also have an outreach and engagement map, which is being supported by our Western PA Regional Data Center as our technical partner. But this outreach and engagement map is really intended to democratize what is happening across the university within communities, and sometimes really being very crystal clear about what the difference between outreach and engagement is. So it's allowing us to have a shared language around outreach and engagement. And it's also encouraging those that believe that they're doing engagement work to really kind of go back to the drawing board and reconsider the ways in which they're partnering with communities and within communities for their benefit, or for unfortunately, sometimes, right, the universities benefit first. That outreach and engagement map is publicly accessible. We encourage our communities to dig in there, and also to contact our University of Pittsburgh employees that are working, whether it's a community of place, or whether it's an understanding of identity. We also have now started an annual event called our Community Engaged Scholarship Forum and our Senior Vice Chancellor for Engagement Partnerships of Distinction Awards. And that really is a cultural cue for our university that is relatively new. We'll be hosting our third annual Community Engaged Scholarship Forum next week. And really, we want to elevate and celebrate work that has been largely marginalized within the traditional lens of the academy. We know that there's a lot of community engaged practitioners. We know that there's a lot of critical practitioners across our campus. And this event is a way that we're able to highlight them and celebrate them as important to building the cultural shift in our institution. Finally, in our newest initiative is our Engaged Scholarship Development Initiative. That is for our faculty and our postdocs. And so we're really helping people from 101 all the way through to really understand and share the ways in which they can engage, again, with a critical lens within communities, understanding what it means to engage within Black and Brown communities specifically, and understanding what it means when you're asking communities to take on water for the academy. So those are the ways in which I'm supporting the institution, and our team is supporting the institution internally. We can shift over to the next slide there. I also wanted to bring up our Pitt Pandemic Service Initiative, because this was really, I would say, a very fast-moving initiative that caused us to completely rethink the way that we engage in faculty and staff volunteerism. The traditional model of faculty and staff volunteerism is really led around a don't you feel good, right? We want you to feel good about yourself and give to communities, work on behalf of communities. Our Pitt Pandemic Service Initiative, through partnering with dozens of community partners, was able very early in the pandemic to jump in and shift our model and our lens from a traditional volunteerism model to really thinking about critical impact areas that were informed by our community partners. So we were told what was most important to communities and what was highest priority. And we shifted from thinking across separating faculty, students, and others to really thinking about impact areas like basic needs, civic participation, digital access and equity, health equity, and education as our starting framework for thinking about how we would be able to contribute through the manpower of the University of Pittsburgh. So that resulted in thousands of hours of volunteerism, partnerships with organizations that we don't usually partner with, and also donations and drives that were completely centered around community voice. We can move on there. I also wanted to share very quickly another way that we were able to decenter the university and work towards broad community goals. Once the pandemic hit, we had a lot of concern coming in from our neighbors on what the potential behavior of our off-campus students might be and how the university was going to incorporate public health and safety into what we were doing. We invested in paid off-campus student safety ambassador positions that were tasked with actually having a physical beat around the neighborhood, engaging our neighbors, talking about safety, encouraging their peers to be safe, and in that way, really showing that we were willing to invest in broad community safety as we are in an urban campus directly surrounded by non-student neighbors. Can move on. And finally, I just wanted to share a little bit about our CECs, which are really groundbreaking for us and somewhat new for us as an institution. Next. This is our director of a Homewood CEC, Darren Ellerby. The CEC in Homewood has been open for over a year, but it really marks an opportunity for the university to decenter itself. We do not own either of our CECs. We're running on 25-year leases in which a community partner owns that property. We can shift to the next slide so we can also show the director of our CEC in the Hill District, Kirk Holbrook. But this is really kind of a centerpiece of our team and an expansion area of our team for the university to show that it is not interested in continuing to kind of take up land as owners, but rather as tenants, and working with community advisory committees to broadly inform our programming, our partnerships, and our research in those communities. Thank you so much for this time, and I'm happy to pass it on.
Thanks, Amy. I'm going to welcome Ken Reardon to the stage here.
Great, thank you very much. We'd like to welcome all of our attendees. I appreciate the opportunity on such a distinguished panel. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the kind of pressure that universities, particularly public universities, and especially urban public serving universities face in terms of dealing with the ongoing cuts to public education and what kind of pressure that puts on the institution. I work at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. It was founded, go to the next slide, in 1964 as an effort on the part of the state legislature to provide an affordable access point to the public university system by opening up a 4-year and then ultimately a 4-year plus graduate program serving poor and working class folks in Boston. We've gone through a period of rapid growth. We're now at the point where we have 13,000 undergraduates, 4,000 graduate students. Overwhelmingly, 75% of these folks are first generation college students, and a very high percentage of them are recent children of immigrants or immigrants themselves. We have a long history as a public university of doing collaborative research and partnership with grassroots organizations. Very famous case done by Marie Kennedy called the Roofless Women's Action Research Mobilization, where she worked with folks living in the homeless shelters of Boston to challenge state shelter policy, which had a great impact. In the 1990s, in a period of great growth, a very legendary and visionary African-American chancellor, seeing the growth potential of the campus, bought a nearby plot of land which had been a failed exposition site. Next slide. And just as we move into the 2000s, of course, we hit the financial crisis with the real estate collapse, really lots of pressure on state budgets. We at the university, our campus had been built at a time when there weren't high standards in construction. The infrastructure began to really suffer. We had to pay for that out of tuition. And we also began to see the aging out of the baby boomers. So the demographic profile, the market, the pool of potential students had shrunk. All this put enormous pressure on the university budget. We woke up one day with a $20 million deficit in a single year, 2017. The state system reacted by firing our African-American chancellor, our provost, and then imposing severe budget cuts. A temporary chancellor brought in saw the opportunity to get out of the hole by developing this 20-acre site next to our campus that the previous chancellor had bought to expand, to allow for a future expansion. And she put out an RFP called Bring Kendall Square at MIT to Harbor Point, meaning an upscale, high-tech bioengineering development scheme that had been carried out in Cambridge by MIT, do something similar to the UMass Boston campus. Next slide. And what emerged after they put out an RFP was the state system's decision to give a 99-year lease to a developer to build on this small footprint, 20 acres, not one, but 2 Empire State Buildings, nearly 6 million square feet of overwhelmingly market rate space for life sciences, commercial activity, residential, retail, et cetera, 20 to 30 story buildings in an area of Boston that's still one of the few areas of affordable housing where the typical housing type is 2 to 3 story walk-ups. So it's also a site that's right on the ocean, Dorchester Bay, and suffers from regular flooding due to sea rise. So in order to move this forward, the developer proposes just the minimum amount of quote unquote affordable housing, most of which would not be affordable to the folks who live in our neighborhoods, Dorchester, South Boston, and Columbia Point. So moving forward, as this plan became public, on the left side, the developer and the university touted all of these things. We're going to turn an underused parking lot area into a vibrant new live-work district, lots of space for the growing sectors where jobs are plentiful in bioengineering. And if we develop this site at the full maximum of 30 stories on each block, we will be able to pay the university, the poorest struggling urban public university, $200 to $230 million. As we began hearing about this, students in my introduction to urban planning class began thinking, well, are there any unintended drawbacks to this? Well, yes. Putting into an area of the most affordable housing in Boston, a very, very high density, large scale market rate development obviously is going to create the kind of gentrification and displacement that Henry talked about at the beginning of the session. Second thing that they noticed is that the definition of affordable housing was really affordable to people who were almost at the area median income, which was largely unattainable, that kind of housing cost for folks living in these neighborhoods. And as a result of this work, the students were able to generate a substantial, next slide, amount of support for a campus-wide movement for anti-gentrification, anti-displacement, reimagining of this project. And they laid out these organizing principles. And moving on to the next slide, they were able to put together a coalition that included the undergraduate student union, the graduate student union, the union representing all the professionals on campus, the faculty union, the chairs union, and then a community-based organization called Dorchester Not for Sale, and the Boston Tenants Organization. And we're now in the process of doing a campaign to put pressure on the university to do these two things, to not permit the project to go forward until the developer sits down and negotiates a legally enforceable community benefits agreement to make sure that the kind of redistribution and protections that Professor Taylor talked about at the beginning of the session are there, and that this get written into the development agreement. Next slide. And for us, it's really a moral, ethical, political, and civic challenge for those of us who are engaged in the community engagement, public scholarship movement. We've had 55 years where faculty on our campus have tried to work respectfully with community-based organizations struggling to create the city on the hill or the beloved community, as Dr. King talked about. And the question is, in order to address our short-term financial difficulties, are we going to permit a development that, if fully built out, will displace significant portions of our neighborhoods, those folks who have the fewest choices and the fewest resources, who in many cases are our own students, our own low-wage workers, but are we willing to make that deal with the devil in order to address our long-term financial? So here's an example of the mechanization, the mechanics or mechanisms of the market economy putting enormous full force pressure on an underfunded public university. And the question is, how do you build a broad-based coalition of campus and community forces to try to push back, resist, and to create a third way forward, sort of along the lines of Professor Taylor talked about at the beginning. So that's the campaign and the struggle we're involved in. As we're pursuing this, we're getting repeated notes from a new chancellor and provost encouraging us to enter into collaborative partnership with the developer so we can get a few internships or perhaps some summer money funding an outreach effort. But in doing so, the price of that will be losing our voice to stand up for justice. So that's the dilemma we face. Thank you.
Thanks, Ken. I appreciate your presentation. We're going to move over to Kent Koth at Seattle.
I first want to just thank fellow panelists and particularly Dr. Taylor for your prophetic message and your call for our community engagement field to enter a new phase 3.0. I just want to share from the perspective of a institution, a Jesuit Catholic institution in the central part of Seattle, which is a city that's experiencing significant gentrification and displacement. How our Community Engagement Center has been trying to work with our community and bridging our campus and community to address issues of market forces. So first, just want to begin with a definition of place-based community engagement. As you can see on the slide, there's several different parts of this definition. A long-term university-wide commitment. So it's recognizing that in our case, at our university, it's a permanent commitment. It is a university-wide commitment and not just one department or discipline. Partnering with local residents, organizations, and other leaders. So it's a collective impact strategy. I think most perhaps significantly for our field, focusing on equally on campus and community, and the equal impact, which often we place more value on our student learning, but placing equal value on community. And then within a clearly defined geographic area. We can go to the next slide. So our university is located in the central part of Seattle. We, 10 years ago, after a long planning process in partnership with our campus and community, made this permanent commitment to focus on neighborhoods adjacent to our campus to the south and to the east. It encompasses really 3 different neighborhoods: our central district of Seattle, which is our historic African-American neighborhood, which when redlining was very overt in our city, it's where African-Americans found a home, and also developed sort of a process of movements of fighting back against oppressive forces. Also included in the neighborhood is the Chinatown International District, which is a historic and current home to our Asian American communities, including our Vietnamese, Japanese, Chinese American, and Filipino American communities. And then just 6 blocks from our campus is Yesler Terrace, which is a public housing community that's been going through a redevelopment process where we've been advocating for the continuation of significant affordable housing. It's about 20,000 people live in the neighborhood and 2 square miles. So let's go to the next slide. So I just want to describe a little bit about some examples of what this looks like. And then my last slide, I share more about what are the ways that this counters the market forces and the pressures we face as a campus. So some examples: the youth media program is a program that has occurred at Yesler Terrace for the past 10 years. It's a partnership with one of our faculty from our College of Arts and Sciences, a photography member, who's partnering with organizations and youth to document the development of Yesler Terrace, and then to hold our elected officials and leaders accountable to the original vision that they had pursued, which was a vision that supported social equity and environmental sustainability. Our RAMP mentoring program at a local middle school is an effort to bridge our campus and our students, and has continued during the pandemic with moving things to online. It's been a space where students can continue to connect. Funding for the community: during the pandemic, we received a large Gates grant, which was, or prior to the pandemic, just prior to the pandemic, we received a Gates grant. We were going to focus on partnerships with schools and communities. We were able to realign that grant and provide direct funds out to the community, $650,000 that directly went out to BIPOC-led, specifically Black-led organizations in our neighborhood to provide support to families, educational supports during the pandemic. And then these last 2 examples, the diversity supply effort has been our effort to look at our procurement strategies as a campus, where we're purchasing from, and shifting those more and more to purchase from local neighborhood organizations and businesses, BIPOC-owned businesses. And it's a campus-wide strategy we're pursuing, particularly as we come out of this pandemic. I'm hoping that that shift will occur. And then finally, last summer, we recognized our students weren't going to be able to visit campus, wouldn't have a chance to get acquainted with Seattle. We use that as an opportunity to create a free 2-unit course for students during the summer. It was an online virtual course open to any incoming student that explored Seattle's contradictions, the fact that we have major tech hubs here of companies, but also families can't get online for their children to learn experientially, and many other contradictions. It's really a class that explores the racialized history of Seattle. It's a way for our students to learn about the experiences in Seattle so that they are ready to engage when they arrive. Next slide. So then the implications of this effort towards transformation, these shifts that we're focusing, we're oriented around connecting people instead of connecting just the university with organizations. It's really a mobilization of residents and campus leaders and students and others to work collectively and with sort of one collective voice. I appreciate Ken's referencing of sort of a mobilization of campus and how it can amplify the voices externally in the wider community. This is an effort to show that history and context matters, that our universities don't exist in a vacuum, and that when students arrive, there's a historic context to the neighborhoods, particularly the neighborhoods adjacent to our campus. It's an effort to pursue anti-racist methods that equip our students with skills to be thinking around the challenges of racism historically and currently in our society. And then most of all, an effort to foster belonging and ownership, particularly among our local families in our local neighborhood and the scholars, the young scholars we're working with in our local neighborhood. So then finally, the last slide is just resources. We have a place-based justice network, which we have started of other institutions like Seattle U that are committed to focusing on geographic regions within a city with an equal campus and community impact, with a mission of deconstructing systems of oppression through place-based engagement, and invite any of you who want to check that out. You can visit us online through our Center for Community Engagement here at Seattle University that houses the network. And then there's a few other resources here, Campus Compact, obviously, Kumu, and then a couple years ago, my colleague here at the university, Erica Yalmore, and I wrote a book that explores place-based community engagement. Again, just want to thank Gavin and Henry and Ken and Jamila for partnering on this effort today. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Kent. And thank you so much, Jamila, Ken, Henry, and Ken again. I'm really honored to be a small part of this effort to pull everyone together. So, you know, I do have some questions in mind, but I don't want to be one of those moderators that just like thinks their questions are more important than everybody else's questions. So let me stop and see, check in with Metasol to see if there are any particular questions that have come in over the chat or anything before I might launch into a question of my own.
I don't see any in the chat, but I would invite folks to submit those so that we can begin the conversation. But I'd like just to say thank you and amen to so much of what you've said, and particularly around thinking about what the 3.0 version might be in a context that really has place at the center, and thinking about how across a network like Campus Compact, we can support each other in moving in that direction, both reflecting on the things that we've done that contributes to a charity mentality and sort of feeds into the market forces versus what we can do differently now in a place of more opportunity for connection, conversation, and a focus on our racist history.
Yeah, I mean, I think the reason why we wanted to do this panel is because so many of us are engaged in projects that are around community engagement, and we might unwittingly be contributing to things that we would find objectionable, you know, gentrification and pressures just to make the university look good, and we feel good about doing it, but yet in reality, we're doing more structural harm. And there's nothing worse in life than going through it unconscious. So I think if we're not really conscious about what we're doing, that to me flies in the face of why we're all community engagement professionals. But we do have a question here for Kent. Starting off, Michael asked, would there be a way for us to have access to the Engaging Seattle course as a model for urban universities? Very practical.
Yeah, I can, maybe I can make that available to Marisol, and then she can make it available to others. We got a description and also a number of different syllabi, and more than welcome to talk offline about that if anybody's interested. It was really it's like taking advantage of a real crisis we're experiencing to move our campus forward.
Great. We also had a question from John come in for Dr. Dukar. To what extent are deliberative dialogues a part of your critical practice?
First, I'll share, I'll refer to myself as future Dr. Dukar, as I'll be proposing this summer. I'm a current doctoral student. But we use deliberative dialogues without actually naming it explicitly. So we do host annual community forums as part of our ongoing practice with our CECs, in which we are pulling in community voice and setting up some very active opportunities for folks to really unpack the polarities of the University of Pittsburgh, investing in neighborhood and attending to the neighborhood in new and different ways, while also somewhat contributing to pressures that others might want to contribute to the neighborhood in less helpful ways. I'll also share, as part of our institutional master plan, we held, I would say, about 13 dialogue sessions with community to really unpack the ways in which we could best invest our dollars, our attention, our programming for broad community benefit, so that our neighborhood enhancement strategies were well informed. And so that's something that we continue to work on, and that's a 10-year plan.
Let me just add some things to that, because I think the deliberative piece lies at the center of everything that we ought to be doing. At the University of Buffalo, we've carried it to a whole new level, I think. Not only and I'll use our health initiative as a way of explaining it, not only everything starts with the community. I mean, and we no longer refer to university community initiatives. We call them community university initiatives, because we want to stress the fact that we're putting the interest of the community first, that we have abandoned the old enlightened engagement strategy, where it's how can we make university and community interests meet each other. I mean, that was good for 1.0 and 2.0, but not for 3.0. So everything starts with the community. We've built this other institute, of which I'm an associate director, the Community Health Equity Research Institute, that's aimed at taking all of this medical science and social sciences and applying it to research projects in the community itself. But we have community residents as part of that governing body. At all levels of the governing body, at this university-based center, we have people from the community in decision-making processes, not just in an advisory process, but where they're actually in a position to make choices and decisions about how this university-based institution operates and works.
Great, thanks, Henry. I had another question here, getting exactly at what Henry is talking about. What are some of the best practices for involving community in these important change efforts through higher education institutions? I might just start by saying I don't know that there is a best practice. I don't know that we've even identified a slate of feasible good first practices, let alone to research what might be the best practices. But I don't know if anyone on the panel wants to take a stab at.
I want to stress two things. One is having people who are part of the community as part of the governing structures for these institutions that operate and function in the community. In most instances, they're situated in an advisory capacity where they advise. And what we believe is that you have to have both that advisory capacity, but they also have to be in actual positions of power. So we have one of our associate directors as a community member. We have community members on our steering committee. We have community members on the board of directors. So I think that's a part of it. The second part of it is that in all of the grants that we develop, we always make sure that we use residents in all aspects of the design and the development of the programs. So it's not just working with them, they're part of the actual design and the development of the research program itself. And not only that, but in all instances, we try to find ways that whenever we bring money in, that they will get a significant share of those resources inside of the community itself.
Yeah, Kent, Ken, or Jamelia, do you all want to take a crack at this one?
Yeah, I would just pick up on what Dr. Taylor was sharing and observe also how we show up at tables that the community is setting, which there's several different collective efforts, collective impact efforts in our local neighborhood that are community driven. One, it's called the Black Community Impact Alliance, which is trying to advocate for combat gentrification in the central part of the city. And so we have a person from our team who attends those meetings, but it's then taking it back to the university to think about how we can amplify that effort. So and that's by invitation. It's not like we said, we want to be at your table, but it was an exploration of how we could partner and amplify.
I'll just kind of piggyback on what Kent has offered. You know, being there all the time, being there when the university doesn't have anything to ask of the community, and really being an active listener is very critical. So our team is present enough where we aren't a new voice at the table, either speaking or listening when it comes time for projects to be co-developed. I would also echo Henry's comments in that you have to involve community at all levels. And that means not only the folks that have positional powers as our Black EDs of nonprofit organizations, but really getting to the resident level and ensuring that you can incorporate that voice at all aspects of your programming.
Great. I mean, the only other thing that I would add is that I think it's really important for payment of community partners to be at the table, because I think there are a lot of professionals who are like expected to do these things. Kent, you talked a little bit about this, but and Henry also did too, about sharing the resources. But I feel like that's really important. And also, it's one thing for you to be at that table, but it's another thing for you to be able to take it to the higher ups in the university and make sure that you say what you heard and not just keeping it within one office. So if you're not connected to the Office of Community Relations or Office of Government Relations or the Chancellor's office or President's office, and you're not actually sharing what you hear at those meetings, I feel like then, you know, cool, you learned about some cool stuff, but you're not actually sharing it with your own power structure and making sure that those voices are represented there. So I didn't know, Ken, did you have anything else that you want to add, or you're on mute?
Yeah. In terms of principles, when I first started doing this work, I've had the good fortune of doing it in East St. Louis, and a group of Black church women, before we would engage with them, laid out 5 principles. And we came to refer to it as the Ciola Accords. And one, we decide on what issues will be addressed, not the university or their funder. Secondly, we participate as an equal, as a co-investigator, co-producer, co-generator of research policies and programs at each step in the research process. 3, it's got to be long-term, and they wanted it 5 years after a 1-year probationary period to see if we were even worthy to be good potential external allies because of their bad experience with the university. According to Henry's notion, the 4th thing they wanted was parity. As soon as I left my first meeting, I'm thinking about where are we going to get the funds to actually pursue this work on an ongoing basis. And they wanted all external funds sought by the university to do applied work in East St. Louis to be distributed 50-50 in terms of, if we need resources to go into the community, they need resources to cover the cost of having folks who need to be trained, directed, protected, guided in their midst. And last, they wanted us to make a commitment to build an independent nonprofit organization, a CEC, very much like Jamila has talked about, that would implement programs. And then the other 2 things that emerged over time as we started following this model, we got some projects going, everything seemed good. And then we were called to a Come to Jesus meeting by these same women and said, in order to do this work, you're getting your students together and you're giving them 12, 15 credits a week in nonprofit management, economic development, basic design, et cetera, et cetera. We, most of whom have been excluded from even a day in higher ed, are getting no training. So when you bring people together in a partnership, bring them around the table, as Ms. Davis said, just giving us a chair at a table we've been denied access to for 400 years doesn't really allow us to gain voice. And they challenged the university to create a neighborhood college in which each semester we would offer 2 courses, no credit, adult education, that would be co-taught by a community leader and a university faculty member on topics that they identified as critical to moving the community resident-led planning effort forward. And over time, over 300 people went through what became known as the East St. Louis Neighborhood College, a curriculum of 12 courses, identified, designed, and co-taught by residents of the community. So those are just a couple of, I think, interesting.
Well, Ken, we had a request for you to be able to share those principles. That's all. Just type in the chat or something.
Happy to do it.
Add a couple of other elements. One of the things that we do is we pay a huge amount of attention to, going back to what Ken said, to the political and cultural principles that anchor. So there's an enormous amount of time spent continuously around conversations and discussions and orientations around those basic principles that we have. So that in efforts with the board members, with steering committee members, residents, as well as community folk, as the university people, the emphasis on everybody knowing and understanding the principles that drive the work, both the political and social principles, is a huge part of the cultivating process. The other thing that we've institutionalized are hard conversations. We don't let the racism or any aspect of racism among our white members go unchallenged. And they're very good at having these open and honest exchanges because we recognize that it is impossible for people not to have implicit and explicit bias. And we wanted to create an environment where this constant discussion and debate is a part of what we do, so that people are comfortable with it, and we can integrate folks. The other thing that we're in the process of doing is that we use and study systemic structural racism. We don't just use that term, but we study this and we use it as an analytical tool, so that when we're developing the different racial projects that we do, we are using this systemic structural racism framework to drive that work and to continue to develop this model as an analytical model, and to educate people on the evolution and the development of the framework, so that they understand that this was a framework that developed over time, and that they know and understand the history of the framework, because we think that the type of analytical tool that you use in engaging in the research is hugely important. So in the NIH proposal that we just put forward on vaccine hesitancy in the African-American and Latinx community, that structural racism framework was used.
Okay, so we only have like 1 more minute left, and there's a really hard question, and I want to see if anybody can try to do like a 45-second answer to it. We all know that community voices should be heard and accepted, but oftentimes communities feel as though they're brought in and they're actually not listened to. So does anybody know of an example where community voices won out in spaces when they weren't popular with leadership?
I can share really, really briefly. We've had this happen more than a few times, and in my honest opinion, it takes having a leader that has some real power within your institution, having a very visible, high-powered leader that can push your work, that can make sure that community voice can be honored. And in our case, we have a senior vice chancellor for engagement, we have a vice chancellor, we have an associate vice chancellor, and all of those folks are working in concert with our team to ensure that our voice can be honored and community voice can be honored. But it does take a very high level leader to make that push, at least at my institution.
I think if you don't have that leader, a good low road to morality that can be pursued is encouraging your community partners to develop a relationship independent of the university with the higher ed finance committee and the state legislature, in the end, that's who all the local campus leaders have to be accountable to. And that can be quite empowering.
I will also say that there are a lot of investigative journalists out there who are always looking for good stories. And so sometimes you have to use the media to push your institution. Henry, do you have a last very quick thought?
The last thing I wanted to say is that I think that one of the big things we have to do is pay attention to the activities of the university's economic and real estate arm.
3 o'clock.
They operate in the dark like roaches. And a lot of the work that we do out in front can be undermined by these folks. And so we have to understand there's the academic faculty driven side, but there is this other side operating in the darkness. I call them Mr. Hyde. Mr. Hyde is out there in the dark doing all kinds of stuff. And that's the real estate and the economic development process. So Dr. Jekyll has got to become aware that Mr. Hyde is out there, and that we a part of our work has to be to figure out how to control Mr. Hyde.
All right, thanks, Henry.
Well,
Thanks,
we'll close it
Marisol.
at that. Yeah, we'll close it at that. Thank you all so much for a wonderful conversation and presentation. Looking forward to maybe moving this to a community of practice so we can explore this more with folks. So again, thank you to our panelists and thank you to our attendees. This webinar will be available on our compact.org website. And until next time, see you all. Bye-bye.